It's more than 10 years now since Nick Mason, who needs no introduction, and writer and racer Mark Hales, that's me, set about creating Into the Red, a grand opus about Nick's car collection. He doesn't like that word, collection. He thinks it sounds too premeditated. But perhaps there's no better word to describe the contents of his garage. In 1997, Nick and I settled for 21 of them for the first edition of the book, spanning almost a century of automotive history. Then 22 for the next, and now 25 for the 2010 edition. And since the Ferrari F60, or Enzo, stars in the latest edition of the book, it makes sense to begin this series of filmed versions with the same car, which Nick added in 2005. The objectives, though, are exactly similar for print and film. The aim was to create an exclusive show, for Nick to describe what it was like to discover and own the cars, but equally important, for me to sit you in the passenger seat and try and convey what it's like to drive them at the limit. As Nick and I have discovered, and as you will see, what people believe is not always the reality. Sometimes, the bigger the reputation, the harder it is for the car to live up to it. And the Enzo came with an awesome reputation. 650 horsepower, 6-speed paddle shift, ceramic brakes the size of dustbin lids, and a 0 to 100 time of 6.6 seconds. And of course, enough downforce via the spectacular tunnels in its spectacular body to double its 1366 kilogram weight. That's like having a VW Golf sitting on the roof, but only provided you're travelling at 200 miles an hour. We'll see whether that's realistic a bit later on, but for starters, why did Nick buy one?
The perception is that because it's red and it's a Ferrari, that absolutely everybody wants one, and whatever the latest one is, then that's what you've got to have. But why did you want one?
Well, I think it being red and being the latest version is actually not necessarily correct. I'm not sure that that's what everyone wants. It's certainly not in my case. I think sometimes with the F40, that if it's a sort of specific production car or specific supercar, then maybe there's something about it that you think sounds particularly interesting. And that was, curiously, it was the case with the F40, and certainly again with the Enzo, because it was clear that this was going to be the next step in terms of technology. And the car absolutely reflects that. It is a sort of Schumacher-era road car, rather than something that perhaps reflects some of the older Ferrari values of great engines and, I won't say not much else, but great design, great engine, which is the F40, rather than the sophistication of the Enzo.
This is the picturesque setting of Anglesey in North Wales, where you'll find Anglesey Circuit. This brand new track was built about 4 years ago, lying in the lee of Snowdon on one side and overlooking the Irish Sea on the other. As you can see, it's a delightful setting, and the track has a good variety of corners, both left and right, and some challenging gradients. Later on in this film, we'll take the Enzo on the roads, but first we need to try the car here. We need a more analytical approach, and we need to answer some questions. It's simply not safe, legal or sensible to exercise a car which can reach over 200 miles an hour and which doesn't develop its half-ton of downforce until it's travelling at well over 100 on the public roads. We also want answers to some questions we already have based on our experience so far. But really, this is a rare opportunity to drive an Enzo harder and faster than usual. It's as Nick says, he sees no point in having a car like this if it isn't used to the full. I'd already driven Nick's Enzo here at Anglesey for a photo session for the latest edition of Into the Red, and my question was about numbers. The Formula One technology that accompanies this car is all about big figures. The problem was that even on a track it simply wasn't possible to reach some of these numbers, so I wasn't getting the benefit of the technology. Perhaps this time a more scientific approach would give me that access. On the other hand, if it was already a challenge even at a track, perhaps the numbers would turn out to be something nice to have, but not terribly useful. I know too that this is not exclusive to the F60. There are a lot of supercars like that, even if not many of them look quite as dramatic. Like any complex machine, it takes a few moments to understand the Enzo's controls. This electric jacking system is designed to cope with speed bumps and city cambers. It drops the nose down at anything above 30 miles an hour to stop the air getting underneath and lifting the car. There are plenty of buttons to learn too, like the race mode for the gearbox and the traction control, which for the moment I will definitely leave switched on. It's amazingly comfortable though, unlike so many of them. Room for a head with a helmet and plenty of room for outstretched legs. And it really is so easy to drive. The semi-automatic transmission and the power assistance for steering and brakes take out all the stress normally involved with a powerful car. Absolutely anyone could drive an Enzo smoothly down the road. Or on the track. Here I'm setting out for the first time on the original set of road tyres, which are now pretty worn, and with the gearbox in standard shift mode and the traction control switched on. And that was just so frustrating. You could hear the front tyres shrieking. No matter how hard I tried, I could not get the front end pinned down, loaded up, and make the front tyres work and steer it round the hairpin. And then when it comes to getting on it, there's me pointing, saying traction control, get off, go away. Because when the traction control does go, you can see how the car just lights up and takes off like a missile. It just looks as if I'm, as if I've set a sundial to wait till I've got the car completely straight before I get on the gas. But actually, there's a couple of times I'm pointing at the steering wheel. I'm on it. But the traction control, it's cut in so ridiculously early.
So you think the tyres have probably gone away a little bit more than
I suppose
they did this morning?
You'd have to say that it seems to have even less grip than it did before. So maybe the tyres are just
got to the end of their life.
Got to the end of their life, yeah. I know road tyres aren't supposed to go like that. In fact, my memory of road tyres is when they get slick and wear down, they actually get better.
Should get better, yeah.
But maybe these aren't like that. Don't know. Hard to say. I mean, it
depends what compound they are.
Yeah, but they're Bridgestones and they were designed for the car, so they should be all right.
You would think they should be very good.
You would, wouldn't you? So maybe they've just gone off because the whole car, it's not together. You've got this deeply unsatisfying thing. There's something interfering all the time. Like, if it's the gear shift, there's the huge pause before it comes back on the gas.
Yeah, there's a big delay there. You can see that on the footage.
And then when you shift down, it seems to rev it up too much, then drop it back in. Then the front doesn't point. Then you're waiting for the gas. So you're cornering or driving it in a series of bits instead of a nice smooth flow. And the engine is just astonishing, as you'd expect.
It's got plenty of torque.
Loads and loads. Quite a sharp power delivery there. So it really comes on with quite a bang. Where you sit, the steering, and how you relate to the surroundings. But, how you sort of integrate with the car. No, I don't like that either. But where you sit, it's all right. All that sort of stuff's okay. But the drive, it's not a nice integrated. You can't make it flow, and you can't get inside the car and make it flow with you. So you've got a nice smooth drive, so everything's happening. So you're braking, you've got it, you make it start to turn, and then you're on the gas, and you blend it all in. It's all
Very good description.
So, I mean, if it is the tyres,
Well, we'll see.
we'll see, won't we?
Yeah.
So we put the sticky ones on, and if that fixes everything, then that's how they should have sold them.
Yeah, definitely.
Towards the end of that run, you're moving around much more.
Yeah, well, towards the end of it, I tried two things. I tried turning on the race,
Right.
which makes the gear shift, which is not particularly, how shall we say, slick. It makes it so savage that I turned it back off again. And then I tried turning off the traction control. And then provided you adapt your driving, which is to accept that the front isn't going to point, but just get it turned and then blend the gas in. As long as you can blend the power in without spinning up the back wheels, then the car starts to come alive.
Yeah, but last night, over a pint, you were telling us that Schumacher tried the same thing.
Yeah. Schumacher at Fiorano couldn't make the Enzo go any quicker around the track by turning off the ASR.
So now we're going to turn off the traction control. There's me pointing a finger to say I'm going to do it. And just look out for how we swap one problem for another. The traction control won't let the car get on it, and it's desperately frustrating. But now we have that huge engine just spinning up the rear wheels. At the end of the run, you'll still see, I think, that the real problem is that the front end doesn't allow you to get into the corner. If you could get in deeper, then you'd be able to point the car out, whether you had the traction control on or off. There you go, that's a big wheel spin. There was no traction control, so the torque just lit up the rear tyres. Hopefully I'll have learned from that experience. A bit of a twitch on the way in, I've got the front loaded up on the brakes, and that's a bit better on the way out. The wheels are spinning, but at least it was driving the car. The traction control hadn't pulled back all the power of the engine. Using those spectacular brakes, pin the front down, see if I can make it point a bit better. Clearly not. Look at the amount of lock I've got on and the howl of the front tyres. But at least I got the power on a bit tidier there. So it's part traction control missing and part driver just learning how to drive and modulate the throttle on the way out. Here's one more. Still a great fistful of lock. Mind you, that is the tightest corner on the track, followed by a right-hander. A lot of lock on there, but there, I've learned how to do it now. It's just a little bit of wheel spin on the way up. The thing to watch is giving it too much. So if you spin up the rear wheels, you really do have a big problem. So it's just enough at the right time.
The problem with turning the ASR off is that if it does spin up the rear wheels, if you don't get it exactly right,
Yeah.
if it does spin up the rear wheels, the penalty costs you a lot more time than leaving the traction control on.
Right.
So I think probably if you could do an ideal lap with the traction control off, then it probably would be quicker. But I mean, I guess even Schumacher had some problems with spinning up the rear wheels, and then once you've got a big tank slapper on, you've got to settle it all down and then go.
And you lost all your time.
So,
Yeah.
you know, terms of lap times, but certainly certain individual corners were much better with the ASR off, and it was generally more satisfying.
Okay. Do you want to have a rest? Hop out, let's let everything cool down, and we'll come back to it in 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
All right?
Well, we've driven the car on track and we've seen how it actually goes, but what's it actually like to sit in? What's the bit that you actually have to use like, and how is it made? So I'll just open up one of the signatures of this car, which is the huge door, which goes up on this great big casting there, supports the entire weight and allows you to get in and out of the thing in a confined space. And there's all the carbon fibre there and the wind-up window. And talking of carbon fibre, you can see the tub here, which is the basis of the car. That's the structure of the car. And it's made of carbon fibre, aluminium, honeycomb sandwich, massively, massively strong. All computer optimised for the strength of the resin, the rate at which it cures, and you know, the thickness to make sure it's completely optimum. It was the current technology of the time in Formula One cars. If you stripped everything off, the tub itself weighs about 200 pounds. It's 50 pounds lighter than this car's predecessor, the F50. There's more carbon fibre here around the cockpit, but obviously not as strong and thick as that. And this is all carbon fibre too, but it's covered in leather. The cockpit itself is actually pretty simple, and in some ways you'd expect it to be, because there isn't a great deal of room to put everything. And when I'm sitting in it, it's comfortable as well. For someone my size, I'm just over 6 feet tall and I've got huge feet, which is a massive problem in some sorts of cars. But here it's not. It's nice and comfortable. My feet are straight out and I can reach the wheel. There's plenty of room for absolutely everything. And if you look down at the floor, you can see that there's no carpets. Just think of the weight you save. But instead, you've got stick-on rubber mats here. There's the plate for the terrified passenger to wedge their feet back against this seat. And down there are the pedals, which are adjustable, but you need a spanner. And if you want to bring one closer to the other, you screw another plate onto it. The seat itself is also pretty minimal by today's standards. There's no electric adjustment whatsoever. There's just a big bar down there and one to raise it up and down. And it's nice and grippy. So it's a very comfortable place to be. And to complete the seating arrangements, or the safety arrangements, there's the Ferrari monogrammed full harness, which takes a few seconds to put on. Now, moving around the rest of the cockpit, there's all the things you'd expect, like the electric mirrors, the fog lights, the parking lights, the hazards, and of course the all-important start button. And there's the heater there, which is a simple arrangement, everything you'd expect: air conditioning, fan temperature, and the control to direct the blast everywhere. These are nice too. That's a very simple, very direct, very obvious way of directing air exactly where you need it. Now, the most important control of all, arguably, is the steering wheel, and that, in true Formula One tradition, has got a lot of the controls and the need-to-know information on it. And for the same reason, a Formula One cockpit is very small, there isn't any room to put stuff, so you concentrate it all on the steering wheel, which is why they cost so much. But right here, you've got, just behind the steering wheel, you've got the gear shift paddles, this one up, this one down, made of carbon fibre, and they're like horns, so that when you've got a small amount of lock on it, you can still tickle it with your fingers. That said, when you've got a lot of lock on, then you can't. The rest of the steering wheel is all the other stuff that you need in day-to-day driving. Indicators here, right and left, press them both to get the hazards up, and the horn. Now, the horn is hidden, or the horn buttons are hidden underneath the leather, and they're exactly where you put your thumbs. So it's all too easy when you're manoeuvring this thing to press the horn, which has a remarkable galvanizing effect on people who are parked in front of you, but it's not something you mean to do. There's some more buttons here. This one is the race button. That speeds up the gear shift. The gear shift is pretty fierce anyway, but you can make it super savage by pressing that. And then it shifts the whole gear selection process. It moves it in 150 milliseconds. Also stiffens up the dampers at the back. The computer stiffens them up so that the rear end of the car doesn't dip down under the savage acceleration, doesn't upset the airflow underneath the car. This one you press at your peril. That's the traction control. If you press that, it turns everything off. All the regulation goes, and all the 650 horsepower and 487 pounds-feet of torque get to the tyres. And if they can't handle it, then the back end spins up and you have a very loose tail very, very quickly. This one, R, is reverse, does exactly what it says, but it's not something you can do quickly. You've got to get the car to a halt, pull both of these, get neutral up there, have your foot on the brake pedal, press the R button, R comes up there in that little window on the rev counter, and you're ready to go backwards. But you've got to be careful with that, because if you trickle around in reverse, it slips the clutch. This car actually has a clutch, like a more conventional car, but you can actually burn the clutch out, and this one's just had a new one fitted at some immense cost. On the left, more buttons here. This one is for the front ride height. That's less about performance and more about driving in town. It lifts the front about 30 millimeters so that you can go over speed bumps without smacking the nose, and also you can drive into your drive if you've got to go down a camber of a road, because there's a lot of front overhang and it'll scrape the nose. Deactivates itself once you reach 30 miles an hour. You can't drive around with it on. The front will come down all by itself. Okay, right, this is not exactly high tech. It's pretty large, and the means of propping it up are about as old-fashioned but as effective as you can get. It's just a simple prop which clips on that rear member, and it's got this natty piece of heat-proof fabric so you don't burn your hands, because when that's been sitting by the silencer, that gets pretty hot. Now, feast your eyes on that. This is the magnificent part of the whole car. And that is a 6-litre all-aluminium V12 with dry sump lubrication. It produces 650 horsepower at 7,800 RPM and 487 pounds-feet of torque at 5,500 RPM. And there's over 300 pounds-feet of that torque available all the way from 3,000 RPM. Now, whatever else we feel about the rest of the car, if we find any faults with it, or if there's bits we don't like, this bit is consistently magnificent. It's all computer controlled, it's got variable intake and exhaust camshafts, it's got flaps in the inlet system to help boost that torque, all of it controlled by the computers. And as Enzo Ferrari once said, aerodynamics are for people who can't build good engines. And that is just a wonderful example. But of course, you can't get 6 litres into a tiny space. I mean, that is a big engine. You look at the length of it and the amount of the car it occupies, then you add the gearbox. But the engine alone weighs just under 500 pounds, that bit there, all on its own. And this bit here, you see, is the dry sump oil tank. It's the racer's preference. The oil is not in the bottom of the engine, it's contained in a separate tank, and it's piped through to the coolers. There's the coolers over there, there's the pipes that feed them, and the air intakes that come up over the flanks to cool the oil. And if the engine is big, the rest of the car is quite big to go with it. You see this here, there's this great big beam here, and these are the coil springs and the shock absorbers. And they have separate reservoirs. These are the gas reservoirs that pressurize the shock absorbers. They're operated by giant, great big bell cranks, big beefy
rocker arms here with rods that go down to the suspension. And there's the computer control. This is the bit which tells the damper how stiff it needs to be according to what the road conditions, how fast you're going. And of course, that's the bit which stiffens up the damper when this big transmission here shifts a gear to stop the tail sitting down. And a big engine needs a big transmission to handle all that power, and this is big. And it's an early generation of paddle shift. It's got the paddles in the cockpit to control it, but it's a robotized manual. It's not a DSG box like the one in the latest Ferraris. So it's got a conventional clutch, which slips if you try and drive it in reverse gear, and this one has burnt out only recently. It's had to be replaced. But the rest of it is conventional shifters like you'll find in all these cars, but with solenoids to operate them and to operate the clutch. So when it changes in 150 milliseconds, it's the equivalent of your feet going like that and your hands going like that. And the faster you make it happen, the more of a bang there is when the clutch goes home. So that's why it feels quite savage when the whole thing is speeded up. Of course, one of the nice things about having everything in the back here is when you lift up this tailgate, you can see everything. And there's this enormous silencer here, which does its best to quieten down all that machinery. But you get a view of this wing here. And this is speed controlled, but it works in conjunction with flaps underneath the car. Because one of the strengths about this car, despite what Enzo Ferrari said about engines and aerodynamics, is the way the air flows through it. It was an attempt to sell the customer some of the aerodynamic efficiency, which had just won them a world championship. So up at the front, you've got flaps which are underneath the car and direct the flow of air through the radiators. But that works in conjunction with this wing here. And from about 39 miles an hour to 160 miles an hour, the wing gradually comes up. But as it does, the flaps at the front shut to keep the balance of the car front to rear. Then after 160 miles an hour, this goes down and the flaps at the front actually extend again. And these venturis, these tunnels here, help suck the air out from underneath the car. They're swept up to speed the air up as it comes out, produce a low pressure underneath the car with a high pressure on top, and that's part of what helps push the car to the ground. And the numbers are quite spectacular. Ferrari says that at 124 miles an hour, the whole car develops 758 pounds of downforce. And at 185 miles an hour, that nearly doubles, about 1,709 pounds of downforce at 185 miles an hour. And you go beyond that, and it progressively reduces. The wing, the flaps at the front, all combine to reduce the downforce back to 1,200 pounds, so to reduce drag, so you can get onto that 217 and a bit miles an hour top speed, like you need to. But we've talked about the engine, the 6-litre V12, which is massively impressive and puts all the speed into the car. But the part that loses it is equally impressive, and it's these 15-inch diameter ceramic discs. And just look at the size of them. Not steel, they're made of a composite material. You've got this huge caliper here and an enormous pad. The pad area that clamps that disc is absolutely vast, so no wonder they're effective. But not just the way they stop the car, it's the fact that you can do it time and time again. You can keep using these brakes round the lap and they don't fade. And this, of course, is the wheel that covers it all. It's 19-inch diameter and 9 inches wide with a 245 section tyre. At the back, similar diameter, 19 inches, but they're 13 inches wide with a 345 section tyre.
You know, Ferrari flourish on this system, which is that you're made to feel very, very special by being allowed to buy a car. Now, quite how difficult it is to join the queue, you never know, but there's certainly, I think sensibly enough, what they do try and do is they try, where they can, to allocate cars to people who they think are, I say collectors, that's not what I mean, are not going to sell the car on. I think they do get deeply irritated by people ordering the car and flogging it on before it's even been unwrapped. I think, to some extent, I've sort of proved myself in that respect. That's certainly how it tended to work in the old days, that there were very clearly people who'd been customers for a very long time and would continue to replace cars. And so they had a relationship with either with the importers, thinking of Maranello and the Colonel and so on, or with Modena Direct. I mean, I think it's worth saying that one of the things that, one of the looks of this car is with all the bodywork sort of up, with the doors open and the tail up and so on. It really looks unbelievably futuristic.
Yeah, and the doors that swing up, I mean, that's not a new idea, that's been a Lamborghini did that for ages, but it's kind of a pointer to the width of the thing, because you get it in an average garage, then how do you get out?
Absolutely.
But I like things like this. There's a mixture of all this sort of computer-controlled high-tech stuff, and then you've got a stay, which you
which could be a broom handle,
with a piece of cloth on it, so you don't burn your hands, because it's been sitting down there getting hot. This great big box here, which is the silencer, and there's all these heat shields everywhere.
Yeah. No, well, you're quite right about the doors. I mean, one of the things is you're sort of expected to be fit enough, I think, to be able to climb through the window. But I was talking about taking it to Sainsbury's. The problem is that if someone then parks up close to you, it's much more difficult to scramble out than just with a regular door.
And it's true that also that a lot of the mileage that goes on your cars is not done by you, and you've explained why that is. But you've always been fantastically relaxed about other people driving your cars, whereas most people who own things like this are very, very possessive. Can you just explain the sort of rationale that allows you to be relaxed about that?
I'm not sure I can, Doctor. I think there's a couple of things. I think, first of all, it's all very well trying to explain to people why a car is so great or what's so special about it. But there's no substitute for driving the thing, and I think generally people are appreciative, and sometimes it's a really important moment for someone to be able to drive a car. The other thing is that very sadly I happen to know that I'm not the world's greatest driver, and consequently quite often it's really useful to have feedback from good drivers, giving their impression of the car and telling me something about it. Plus the fact I always like the thing of having people in the car, whether it's a Stone House or a Damon Hill or whatever. I like that. But at a more general level, I've always liked the idea of having the cars written about. So I've always had I'm fairly relaxed about journalists driving the cars. And I have to say, most of the time, it's been fine. Yes, there's been odd accidents at odd times, but nothing irreparable, nothing too dreadful. I suppose the other thing is that for the pleasure it gives other people to drive compared to the risk involved, I think every time let other people drive holds good.
And I know you, having sort of worked a bit with you over 10 years, you like to see your cars in action. You like to see them being exercised, don't you?
Yeah, I do, because I think that's what they're there for, I suppose you could say.
There's a quote from Into the Red that the cars only achieve their true beauty when they're being driven rather than sat in a museum.
Yeah,
I think that one came from you, didn't it?
Yeah, and having said that, I think it's very important to say that I think museums are important as well. That's one of the reasons I'm involved in the National Motor Museum. I do believe that we should keep absolute, perfect examples of a few cars from a period. I think it's, it'll be very tricky for someone to examine some of my cars in the future and go, good Lord, they had Cosworth pistons in 1903, that sort of thing. It's confusing, or shell bearings or whatever ghastly sort of bit of
Modernity.
stuff has gone on, or electronic ignition or whatever. But no, I tell you what it is. I also think that the cars they are art at one level. You know, it's always arguable about is it art, craft, or whatever, but they are machines and they are built to do a specific job. And I actually don't like that business of becoming too precious about them. I don't necessarily want them to be absolutely perfect and ready to win that Concorde Elegance. I think the car actually looks better if it's got a little bit of use on it. So I don't have that thing about taking cars out in the rain, for instance. You know, it doesn't, I don't think, oh God, it's raining, I've got to put it away. But,
Now it was time for something easy, or possibly frightening, it all depends. We would take to the road in a 200-mile-an-hour car from which you can't see anything behind and which is wider than the average lorry. In which case, it was probably only fitting that Nick should be in charge. After all, it is his car, even if he hasn't driven it for a year. This is Bob Houghton's Ferrari Emporium in Northleach. It was Bob's men who recently fitted the Enzo's clutch, and we're here to collect the car after some attention to the brakes.
Would you like to drive your car, Mr. Mason? Since it is what I have. I suppose you should.
These hadn't felt quite the mighty item of legend, and the reason was worn pads. A set of pads that lasts just 10,000 miles sounds a touch fragile, but they were rather cheaper to replace than the clutch, which had only lasted 700 miles. That, though, is what happens when journalists use the launch control or anybody engages reverse.
Immediate feeling of trepidation. Are we going to clang a wheel on a curb or something?
and we're lost already.
Yes, already.
In a moment.
Do you think Bob had just cleaned this?
Probably. But on the other hand, if you start taking a view that you shouldn't drive the cars because it's wet, you immediately...
Well, there's lots of people who do, aren't there? There's lots of people who do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if that's what they want, that's fine. But it's sort of always been the theory that you do let the cars get wet. This is one of those cars where you're not expected to put the radio on. You are expected to listen to the...
But the F50 had a radio, but it's inconceivable that you can actually hear anything.
Absolutely. And of course, the problem really is it's not fantastic Ferrari engine noise, it's an enormous amount of tyre noise.
Yes, road noise. But I mean, hang on, it is a great thing to be in, isn't it?
Yeah.
You do get a special feeling.
And you do get quite, I mean, this sort of road is fine, but as soon as you're somewhere with, where you're actually having to gauge the width of the car,
Yeah.
it does all get a little bit tricky.
Yeah. British B roads, in other words.
And it is it's a major problem. It's not only, it doesn't just apply to Ferrari Enzos. The reality is that most of the vehicles we drive have become fatter and fatter.
Yeah.
And with cars parked now, I mean, certainly in London, there are roads that become absolute sort of signal track.
Yeah. And if you
Track with no passing places.
How long is it since you've actually driven this on the roads?
A year, I should think, at least. Now you see, here we are.
Hang on. Well, not yet. Can you see anything?
I can see absolutely nothing.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll have to. Oh, just a minute. After the minute.
I've got a bit of a.
Yeah. Clear. I think. Don't turn any more. Yeah. Clear.
Okay, now see, if there's a feed-in, it's fine, because I can now pick it up in the mirror. But before that...
Well, that noise is... that noise is fantastic. Actually, is that strictly fair, though? Because as you said a while ago, when we were pulling out, it's because it's left-hand drive.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
If it had been right-hand drive, it would have been easier, I guess, because you'd have been sitting where I was.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe where I am.
Yeah, one of the things you're buying with this is you're buying a prototype, really.
Yes.
It won't ever be as developed, and the F40 is the same. You know, you're buying something rather special, but it will never have had the same development that you'll get on the later cars. In fact, I'll use this to some extent. I mean, I sort of laugh at it slightly, but the FXX concept, whereby you get your customers to feed information back. I mean, there's another story of, it's always said about Aston Martin that David Brown, all the development work was done by the early customers.
I think they said that about TVR as well, and probably plenty of others. And yet, you know, perversely, when Honda decided to enter the market with the NSX, and they fixed all the problems, you know, although they couldn't say as much, the word was that it was a Ferrari with all the little quirks fixed. And everybody said, oh, well, we really quite like the quirks. You've spoilt it now. But do you think this is any more intimidating than the F40? I mean, apart from the sort of explosive power delivery of the F40?
Well, it's probably less intimidating in some ways.
It's got more stuff on it to help you, hasn't it? Like paddles and things.
And you know, the F40 was always pretty... Right, can you see your way?
Clear to the right as far as I can see.
Oh!
Yes. The other problem is you have to loosen your belts, don't you? I've no idea where we are. I hope you do.
I've got an idea of how to get home at the moment, which by just going back, but
as long as it doesn't involve turning round.
There's a way to do this.
Is a pull. Yes.
And
Come on, just go a bit further right. If you're quick. Not that quick. You famously didn't buy a McLaren F1, but do you think that was a better resolved? Do you think they spent more time? Because that was a fully homologated car.
yeah. No, I mean, I famously didn't, just because I think probably it was one of those points which I'd run out of money, but I do, you know, I made up for it later with the GTR. I think that probably was a more finely honed. You know, I think Gordon spent an awful lot of time trying to build. He had a very clear vision of what he wanted.
Well, if you're happy, if you want to.
Yeah, I was sort of going to head to North Sony and then north back towards.
Yeah. I mean, it would be good to sort of negotiate it through a town. I think. I want to watch how you do it. Ferraris are special, though, aren't they? It's very hard to. It's impossible to deny the romance of the things.
No, fantastic when you go somewhere like Bob's and see them all sort of gathered together.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, yeah. Just interesting the number of the front-engine ones there were there.
Yeah.
So you've not been tempted by one of those?
Front engine.
Yeah, 599 or 575 or.
I mean, my problem really is that even the Enzo is horribly underused. You know, because unless it's a high day or a holiday, I still live a life where I'm carrying things around. You know, whether they be children, drum kits, dogs. So actually, those sort of cars. I mean, the F40, the Otto Che, and this is already too many.
Yes.
Plus V8 Zagato. The good thing about competition cars is you justify their existence with one decent outing.
Yes,
the Goodwood
absolutely.
Revival and things justify the reason for having it. The London to Brighton justifies the 1901 Panhard.
Yes. Did you do that this year?
Yeah, we had a puncture and failed horribly. Although, to its credit, there were some cracked cylinders. It was horribly down on power, and it was still chuntering along at 40 miles an hour.
I think that for the sort of car it is, I think this rides quite well.
Yeah.
Has it got? Can you stiffen it all up? Has it got a? I don't think it has.
I think that's why you have a riding mechanic.
Oh, is it?
That's your job, to find the knob and change it.
Okay. I'll have a look round.
It
It might be on the steering wheel. Just don't turn the one off that says ASR.
Or the one that goes launch control.
Yes, that's right. It's supposed to be cold now. Careful. One thing at a time. I'll do that. Okay. Bit more. Hang on. Clear as far as I can see.
That's the most alarming thing you can possibly say.
It was clear.
But you're saying, well, one tends not to sort of push, and the answer is because again, I'm working a little bit if I'm pushing, because I'm looking for oncoming traffic and then thinking, well, I'll stay really in because it's alarming. If the roads really are a bit thin.
When Ferrari launched the Enzo in 2002, standard fit was the Bridgestone Potenza Scuderia tyre that had been developed specially for the car. The Potenza's main task was to handle speeds in excess of 220 miles an hour, but also deal with the less glamorous jobs like good traction and predictable handling on wet and dry roads. Despite that, Bridgestone also said that the tyre was not intended for near freezing conditions, and its performance tails off as the thermometer drops. What might be fine on a summer's afternoon in Italy could prove tricky on a Welsh racetrack in autumn. So we've brought along a brand new set of Pirelli P0 Corsas. The Corsa is much more of a track-orientated tyre with a stickier compound than the Bridgestone, so it'll be interesting to see how we get on with them, and if they change the overall level of grip or the Enzo's handling balance. Even if they didn't, most people thought the black wheels suited the car so much better than the silver ones. When we tried this car before, turning off the traction control made very little difference, and there's that celebrated story about Schumacher. Couldn't go any faster at Fiorano with the traction control turned off, I mean even with his talent. So the fact that we were a great deal quicker, it was about nearly 3 seconds quicker with the traction control turned off on the old worn out tyres. I'm not quite sure what that says. There's either the balance of the car needs adjusting to suit the tyre, whatever tyres it's got, or the grip had gone away so dramatically. It's very difficult. But the main advantage with turning the traction control off, as you would expect, is that you could gas it out the corners. Whereas with the traction control turned on, it just switches off all the power until you're almost out the corner. So that was the big difference. It didn't make any difference with the speed into it. And then putting the new rubber on, it increased the point at the front. The car was much more direct into the corners, but it didn't make any difference at the back. So if you turn the traction control off, it would still spin up the rears. So it's very, very confusing. I think maybe the car needs adjusting to suit whatever rubber it's got.
When we came down over the crest on the second lap, it was out of shape at the back as we came down the hill.
Yeah.
Do you think you could adjust your way out of that?
Difficult to know, really. I mean, it seems to be very sensitive to grip at either end, and it got out of shape at the back as the box shifted down, and that's all programmed. There's nothing you can do to alter that. And just that little, change in weight, shifting about as the gear goes down, was enough to make the rear slither.
So is it uncomfortable to drive?
It's uncomfortable is the wrong word. It's frustrating because you always think you should be going quicker.
Just because it's got so much power?
Because it's got so much power, and you feel as if you should be able to use more of that power. But on the tight ones, if you just the tiniest touch too much gas early on in the corner, and the back's gone, and you have to wait, you can catch it, but then you have to wait for it all to settle before you can get back on the power again.
So it costs you a lot?
It costs you a huge amount of time. You can't just gently pour on the power.
And what about, how does it stop?
The brakes, actually, for a car of the size and weight it is, the brakes are very impressive. There's great big carbon discs. I think that we've got a pad issue here. The pads are getting a bit low, but they didn't wilt really at all during the whole day. We could lean on them all day and pedal hardly. It was a bit grumbly and groany, but it's quite amazing how a car of that size and weight will stop. It's pulling 143 miles an hour up the hill.
That's the fastest part of the circuit?
Yeah. And the fastest part of the circuit into the slowest corner, which is blind. So it's a whole heap of challenges, and it was very difficult to get that corner right in that car, because it's terribly easy to go over the crest where the car goes light, the ABS cuts in, and then you sail wide of the apex.
So by putting new rubber on it, you're bringing up the level of grip, but possibly the car needs to be analysed before all of that.
Yeah. I think that the fact is that as a road car, it's optimised to be completely safe, and so the front end doesn't have a great deal of point, and the traction control is very intrusive, because you don't want people to be spinning the car going into corners. You don't want them to be lighting up the back with the massive amount of torque and power. So I think probably as a road car, like so many of these big GTs, it's made to be safe on the road. As soon as you bring it to a track, because it's massively disappointing. So if you were going to use it on track, yeah, I think you'd want to do some optimising. You'd want to do something with the ride heights, because even with the variable height of the nose, that's a bit, so you can put the front up so it doesn't take the splitter off when you go over a sleeping policeman. The electric ride height variation, even with it at its lowest setting, there's a great gap under the front. So if you're going to use it regularly on track, you'd have to optimise it, I think.
So the reality is, it's not a track car?
It looks as if it should be, and I think the maker wants you to believe that there's a great deal of sort of track experience gone into making it. But I think the reality is that in order to sell it to the general public,
without killing them?
Yeah, without sending them off backwards into the nearest fence, it's probably got to be kept very, very safe. Because if you turn the traction control off around one of those tight hairpins where you saw, there's the slightest touch too much gas and the back's gone. It's lit up both rear wheels and they're about this wide.
Flintstone style.
Yeah.
So is it is it recoverable? Is it fixable?
Oh, I mean, it's by no means a disaster, is it? But I think it's, in the nicest possible way. It's more of a statement than it is a practical, high-speed touring machine.
And are there adjustments?
Yeah, but it's not very adjustable as it is. But you could adjust it to suit the track. But then I don't know what it would be like on the road then.
So it is set up in an understeer manner, and you need a bit of oversteer on it.
I wouldn't say you need a bit of oversteer on it, but understeer is safe because you just keep turning the wheel in the direction you want to go. Oversteer, you have to make a decision how much lock to put on and when to take it off again. Otherwise, you have your accident going backwards instead of forwards. So it's still an interesting, spectacular car. But I sometimes wonder just how usable these things really are.
I mean, you'd actually be better off buying a Caterham.
Well,
or 10
it's
for the
not.
price.
It's not quite the same thing, is it? But a Caterham's an extreme choice, and it's very good at what it does as a track weapon. But I think if you wanted to do a lot of track work, the Enzo is not the car you'd pick.
How does the Enzo impress, though? In what way does it take your breath away? Because you obviously like it, broadly.
Yeah, because it's such a challenge. It constantly asks you to be very, very sensitive to how you use the controls, particularly, the accelerator pedal. And because it's got such a wonderful engine, and the gear change is a bit savage. And it has great gaps exactly where you don't want them. And if you put it in the race setting, no wonder it's just had a new clutch. So every time it changes, it's like you've been hit up the back with a hammer. So I didn't use the race settings. I just thought, Nick's just had a new clutch. He probably wants it to last more than 10,000 miles. So I left it on the standard, and it's still pretty savage. So there's great gaps where you don't want them. But it's still an interesting challenge to try and put all those things together and see if there's anything you can do to drive around them. But it's quite a handful.
An all-out grunt. It's a pretty quick cut.
Oh yeah. I mean, the engine. The engine is just sensational. The noise it makes and the amount of poke it's got, and the fact you can just press the starter and it sits there happily ticking over, and then you pull the paddle and go, and it just takes off like a missile. So all that's very exciting.
And it stops well.
It does stop well, yeah. For the given the size and weight, so it goes well and it stops well. It's just the bits that connect those that could do with perhaps a little bit of optimization. But then, as I've said right at the beginning, it is a road car. You have to remember, it was not designed as a race car. They built a Maserati version called the MC12 with all the underpinnings of the Enzo underpinnings, and it won the championship. So yeah, it can be optimized, but just as presented, it's not.
Flawed genius.
Flawed potential. No, it's potentially a great track car, but you'd need to fiddle with it in order to realise that. But that's true of so many of them.
Pretty expensive track car.
Pretty expensive, yeah. So we've been driving this car quite a bit now on road and on track. We've been trying to get to the bottom of whether it's actually a compromised road car or a compromised track car or both. Well, it may be all of those things, but let's just say it is a fantastic statement. We love the engine, we love the brakes. It's a dramatic looking thing. Whether you actually like the looks or not doesn't matter. It is dramatic, and it's a hell of a thing to drive. And it's not actually that difficult to drive. It's easy. I can just drive and chat like this. As long as you remember the size of the thing, all the systems, the paddles, you don't have to worry about the gear shift. You've got all sorts of electronic systems to keep you safe. You can't give it too much gas as long as you leave that switched on. So it's exciting, it's dramatic, and let's not forget that the 350 people who bought the first batch of these obviously didn't care, because they bought them without even seeing them. Ferrari didn't release any details or any pictures, so the people didn't even know what they looked like when they put their money down. So they didn't care, and presumably they're still very happy with them. So on the question of performance, what did they get for their money? Well, it's a difficult one. The speed, or the ultimate performance of this car, is supposed to come from its aerodynamics. It develops half a ton of downforce, but it only does that at 185 miles an hour. So if you accept that you've got to go to a track in order to unleash this thing without getting locked up or killing yourself or somebody else, if you go to a track, it's hard to find even a track in the UK where you can do 185 miles an hour. If you go to the good tracks, even the grand ones, Silverstone, there aren't that many corners where you're going to be doing 120, 130 miles an hour, let alone 185. Most of them will be second gear in this car. So you're not getting the benefits of the aerodynamics. So if most of the corners are second gear, you need grip from the tyres. And there isn't enough from the tyres to harness the capability of this car. It's just a fact. It's not alone in that. The McLaren F1 was just the same. And it's the way the car uses its tyres. So there's nothing wrong with the tyres either. There was a time, going back, Jaguar D-Type, the GTO, F40, there are lots more modern examples. Almost any modern high-performance saloon or sports car is designed to get the best from its tyres at the speeds, at sensible speeds where the car's going to be operating. For whatever reason, that's not true with this. So you haven't got the mechanical grip at low speeds, and you can't access the aerodynamic grip at very high speeds. And that really, in a nutshell, is the problem with this car. But you also have to remember where this car came from. It was essentially designed at the end of the 90s, so it's a 10-year-old car. It's easy to forget that, whilst not exactly historic, it's not a bang-up-to-date car. There have been enormous advances in gearboxes in particular, the latest DSG gearboxes, and in Ferrari's own camp, the latest F430 can lap the Ferrari test track at exactly the same speed as this could. And it's almost certainly true that there will be more drivers who are capable of doing that. So in other words, it's more accessible. So things have come on a bit. But the engine is just fantastic. It pulls from virtually nothing. It sounds glorious. And the acceleration is meteoric. It's absolutely seamless the way it pulls through the range. Glorious, wonderful thing. Ferraris almost always have had wonderful engines, and this is no exception. The brakes are sensational. This is one of the first supercars I've ever driven where you can lap consistently without getting a soggy brake pedal. I mean, the McLaren F1, you only needed to do 2 or 3 laps and the brakes were grumbling and grinding. That doesn't happen with this. And it is a dramatic thing to sit in and drive. It's comfortable, it's very fast in a straight line, and it's the biggest statement you could possibly make just by driving down the road.